certainly is vital to Turkish historical development, but it's also vital to Kurdish national development and historical development in the same sense that you wouldn't have had a modern Turkey if it weren't for Russia brutalizing the Ottoman Empire. The extreme shifts that Ataturk imposed on Turkish and Kurdish culture allowed the idea of Kurdish nationalism to sort of come to the fore.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Rory, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this time?
Well, I'm a little bit disturbed by news out of Turkey.
Yes,
probably.
it does seem quite horrendous.
Seems pretty grim. It's tangentially related to what we're talking about today, but we'd gotten what seemed like some pretty good news out of Turkey, which sent me on the research journey that I've been on this past week to talk about the Kurds, because it looked like Erdogan's government and his hyper-nationalist partners in government seemed very open to peace with the Kurds, which is extraordinarily positive news. But as is often the case with Erdogan, is he sort of giveth and he taketh away, and he has taketh away in a very, very big way. A really bright spot in Turkish democracy, which sort of really helped undermine people who claimed that Turkey wasn't a democracy, was the fact that the opposition party had been in power in Istanbul for a number of years now. I think Ekrem İmamoğlu had won 2 elections at this point. I could be wrong about that. It was not what I was doing detailed research on for this podcast. Now he has been arrested, it's almost amusingly, on accusations that he's somehow aligned with the Kurdish terror groups that Turkish government is currently engaged in a peace process with. It's fairly clear to me that these allegations are nonsense. This is not the leader of, but certainly one of the leading figures in the JHP, or the CHP as it appears in English, I think it's Republican People's Party, the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, which is the party of Ataturk. And it's not just Ataturk, this is going into the 1990s. This is the party of dramatically repressing Kurds. So the idea that he's got some kind of alignment with the PKK is pretty hard to credit. I think this is pretty much exactly what it looks like. It is Erdogan or his government or his party acting to take one of the biggest contenders for his presidential seat out of the running. And it's a real crisis point for Turkish democracy.
Was he quite popular with non-Kurdish voters?
Oh, I think he's probably popular with Kurdish voters too. The 1990s are a long time ago. He was able to win multiple elections. This is Ekrem İmamoğlu in Istanbul, in the largest Kurdish city, which is Istanbul. Istanbul is sort of the largest city for a lot of groups because it is a very big city. 18 to 20 million people, estimates vary, and has, I think, at least, 1 million plus Kurds. And he wins elections there. Because Istanbul is such a huge city, the mayoralty, the mayorship of Istanbul is tremendously significant. That is actually the seat that Erdogan held before he became prime minister of Turkey. And in fact, he was arrested as mayor of Istanbul, which is sort of, a lot of people are taking heart from that parallel that, well, gosh, is this just the standard path to power in Turkey now? You're the mayor of Istanbul, you spend some time in jail, and then you get to be in charge of the country. I am less heartened by that. The government, which I believe was JHP-led, preceded Erdogan, was truly delegitimized, was a sort of cataclysmic failure of a party, both on financial issues. There was a huge financial crisis around the turn of the millennium in Turkey, but also because of their mismanagement of the Kurdish issue. The jailed Erdogan and, the jailing of Erdogan being followed by the victory of his party was sort of pushing on a very open door, electorally speaking. I'm not confident that Erdogan and the AK Party are currently as weak as the people before them were. I am mostly just alarmed and not taking much solace from the biographical similarities between İmamoğlu and Erdogan. This is bad.
Can you see much happening with the protests, or will they just fizzle out like a lot of the protests tend to?
So this is kind of going to come out 4 or 5 days
Mhm.
later, and who knows? Who knows what we'll see? I have a lot of personal experience with protests in Turkey. I was there during the Gezi Park uprising in 2013, and that mostly happened in my neighborhood. I got tear gassed a lot. Where the current status of the power of the Turkish streets is, what kind of coalitions might be formed against this action, I just can't speak to at this point, Rory. But we'll probably know more by the time this is broadcast on Monday. My hopes are not particularly high. I think that Erdogan is in a position of strength geopolitically. Europe and the United States both want his acquiescence and his cooperation on problems that the United States has created, from Ukraine to Israel, Gaza, Syria, etc. So, he's not feeling a lot of pressure from that direction, and he's proven to be pretty good at resisting pressure internally. So I do think this might stand. Well, it's obviously something we're going to follow closely, but it's not actually the topic of
But it
today's
is related.
podcast. It is indisputably related. I was inspired by the progress of a peace process with two Kurdish populations. In Syria, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is just sort of a U.S.-sponsored envelope around a harder core of Kurdish groups in Syria, and the PKK, the fabled terrorist organization that Turkey has always hated Syria's Kurds for their affiliations with, is making really dramatic toward peace with the Turkish government. So I thought that this was an opportune time to fill in sort of a gap in my education and really do a deep dive on the Kurds. Today, we're not going to be talking about either of those peace processes. What I'm envisioning for this week is sort of like a Kurds week
Okay.
at the More Freedom Foundation. On Monday, this podcast will be released, and then probably on Thursday or Friday, I want to do a live presentation on the YouTube channel talking about more about that peace process. Today, I'd like to focus just on the history of the Kurds more generally. I have made my way half through this book, A Modern History of the Kurds, which is quite extraordinary, quite lengthy.
Yes. It almost looks like a reference book. It's
It
so big.
It is 600 fun pages, 660 fun pages, and honestly, I'm finding it like revelatory. I am making a point of reading all the footnotes, which is a little mind-numbing, but it is fascinating because it's really growing my sense of the Kurdish problem, like the fundamental issues that have been facing the Kurds, not for the 150 years, depending on how you measure it, of Euro-US dominance in the Kurdish region, but for the 400 years before that as well.
Yes, they've been dealing
and
with empires for a long time.
Yes, and to the extent where it's interesting, you look at the status of the Kurds today, which is being divided, actually probably good to students at the outset, the modern territory of the Kurds, referred by many aspiring political groups as Kurdistan, is divided between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And it is not a static territory. Horrific, mostly through the offices of horrific crimes committed by a variety of empires around them, and sometimes by the Kurds themselves. The status, the size, the demographic balances within these territories have shifted dramatically. I was surprised to find 100 years ago, folks were talking about Mosul, a city in northern Iraq, as primarily a Kurdish city. There's certainly still very large Kurdish populations in Mosul, but it is because of, I guess, yes, at this point, over 100 years of administration by a Arab Iraqi government. Mosul and its proximity to oil and gas resources, the Iraqi governments for a century have made it a priority to fill Mosul with Arabs, to sort of make demographic changes. And these sorts of things have been happening to the Kurds throughout their modern sort of history of division between four separate states. What this book really emphasized, though, is that division and that like perpetual screwedness of the Kurds goes back
A long time.
500 years at the very least.
30 to 45 million people.
Yes.
So it's quite a sizable population. and considered one of the largest stateless groups in the world.
And I think quite fairly. The question, of course, the cursed question is, that's why the estimates. You say 30 to 35. I was looking at a 35 to 40. We just don't know, because leaving aside the just general state of consistent horror, we have in these. I mean, over the past decade, we have seen what can be described as ethnic cleansing or genocide against the Kurds in Syria. The decade before that, let me think, was that not such a bad decade?
What decade
Well, there
was
was
that?
certainly the 2000s.
Okay.
So this is the 2010s. In the 2000s, we saw certainly the Iraqi Kurds achieve new levels of autonomy, and I think in the 2000s the Turkey thing was calming down. But in the 90s, we saw horrific, I think plausibly can be described as ethnic cleansing, at the least, crimes committed against the Kurds of Turkey. In the 1980s, we have the horrific Halabja massacre and the broader Anfal campaign committed against the Kurds in Iraq. I didn't quite appreciate how the Iran-Iraq war involved, by both Iraq and Iran, involved serious conflicts against their own Kurdish populations, where there was this, the Iranians were kind of semi-demi cooperating with the Kurds in Iraq while they were
Killing them at home.
killing their own Kurds, and Saddam Hussein of Iraq was doing the opposite. He was committing genocide against the Kurds of Iraq while he was helping the Kurds of Iran. It's just, so you have these ongoing crimes, but even outside of the context of these crimes, it's a tremendously politically fraught thing. What degree of the populations in these countries is actually Kurdish?
But also, doesn't the language change, or is it sort of considered to be like a very strong dialect differences? Because it's sort of hard to just sort of say these are all one homogenous people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was sort of this book at one point was sort of wondering, is the difference between the two main streams of Kurdish language the difference between, is it more like the difference between German and English? Or is it more like the difference between German and Dutch, which is a lot closer? And that would vary. And it's not just the two languages. There's also a wide array of other languages. I think what we can say about the modern era, this sort of post-Ottoman, post-Safavid Empire era, is that things have absolutely gotten more complicated for the Kurds, but that's added on top of a baseline of deep, deep complexity that goes back 500 years and goes back to the dispute between the Safavids and the Ottomans.
Was the Ottoman era considered one of the best for the Kurdish?
Oh man, that's a really hard. It's kind of hard to point to a Kurdish golden age. Actually, no, it's not. The greatest, probably the greatest historical Kurdish figure is one of the greatest Islamic figures, Saladin. I think the empire that he founded was the Ayyubid Empire. And I think that most historians agree that he counts as Kurdish. Saladin is famous. He's actually been famous in Europe going back 1,000 years. The courtly romances and sort of he was seen as this very, very noble Arab enemy, even by the very bigoted people of the Middle Ages in Europe. His competition, are they contemporaries? I believe like his competition with Richard the Lionhearted, Richard II, who is I think most would now argue pretty unfairly lionized, quite literally, English king who went on crusade, and there's, they were so polite and courtly to each other or what have you. But Saladin, functionally, why he's famous is because he's the guy who kicked the Crusaders out of Jerusalem. After, I think the Crusaders took Jerusalem in 1099, and then Saladin kicked them out about 100 years later, and Europeans didn't come back to Jerusalem until the early 1900s. So that's sort of Saladin, and he's a Kurd. So we can't talk about the history of the Kurds without mentioning Saladin. But this gets to the sort of cursed problem of nationalism that we are going to be talking about for really the entirety of this episode. Part of the problem for Kurdistan, part of the reasons why Kurdistan never was established, even though there was, I think, less than advertised, but there was legitimate British interest in setting up a Kurdistan to screw over everybody else around there. The American interest, I think, was actually a lot less. I think.
Well, yeah, they seem to show, is it
Mhm.
Woodrow Wilson?
Yeah.
And then he was a bit like, yeah, and you sorted out Britain.
Essentially, I think that when the Allies thought that they could rely on the United States to come be part of their let's divvy up the rest of the world into empire party, there was some talk of the United States having a mandate of Kurdistan or something like that. It was a pretty unappealing, pretty expensive prospect that the British desperately didn't want to be involved in. One of the great details, which very much serves points that I've made, which is, in fact, the British Empire ended during World War One. That's not what it looks like, because after World War One, the British actually got a lot more territory to take over, specifically the remnants of the Ottoman Empire, specifically that stretch of land from the Mediterranean, Israel, that is modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and then Iraq. That was new land for the British Empire. So the British Empire grew after World War One. But looking at the minutiae here, and this book includes a lot of the internal discussions of the British and the way that the politics worked. The main thing that the British were about was desperately trying to save money because they didn't have
Yeah.
any. And that was sort of this idea that the United States was going to take over Kurdistan and take the mandate of Kurdistan, like the British mandate over Palestine, the French mandate over Syria, was really just sort of something that the British wanted and the Americans never had any interest in. And I think this book sort of emphasizes that. But to sort of go back all the way back is sort of part of the reason why the British failed to create a Kurdistan was because the Kurds themselves weren't,
Cooperative?
well, they just weren't living in that ideological
Well, because I
space.
heard the idea that the British told the Ottomans about like nation states and was like, oh, this is how you treat a nation state, which kind of made them think, well, then we'll just treat them as if they're one of this new nation of Turkey. So that kind of got away with it when if they were maybe considered how empires used to do things, they might have been a bit more autonomous.
So that's yeah, that you've put your finger right on it, and just like how fraught this process was. The Ottoman Empire was tremendously successful in the 1400s, 1500s, as late as the late 1600s. It was able to threaten Vienna in the 1680s, I believe, is the year. But over the course of the 1700s and accelerating after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, nationalism became much, much more important. And what happened to the Ottoman Empire in Europe over the course of already starting in the 1700s, but accelerating even in the early 1800s, was people like the Serbs and the Hungarians and the Romanians and other Slavs started developing very European style, very strong ideas of nationalism. And even down to 1908, which is the sort of nationalist coup
Hmm.
that didn't completely throw out the Sultan, but basically put in place a hyper-nationalist government that ended up carrying out the Armenian genocide. Even in 1908, there was still some tension. Like, oh, okay, this is the I think it was was the Committee of Union and Progress or something along those lines, was the government that took over Turkey in 1908. In 1908, there was still like, oh, well, Armenians and Greeks can be part of this too, and we're all sort of together and la ta ta ta. But rather quickly, the Turks, sort of as a catch-up thing, started opting for a much more virulent form of nationalism. And this was, of course, always this was an undercurrent across the 19th century for the Ottomans. And it's interesting, before nationalism was the dynamic in Europe, the dynamic was a strong consolidation of the empires within Europe. So across the 1700s, they call them enlightened despots. Across the 1700s and the 1800s, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the French Empire, Prussians that eventually became the German Empire, were working to consolidate and crush exactly that kind of diversity that you were talking about. Just the old empires that would govern through relationships with local leaders that could be a little more autonomous. That was being crushed in Europe, which was making those countries much, much more powerful. So in the 1800s, the Ottoman emperors realized this, so they had to go and like hyper consolidate, and that was like their big focus. And then nationalism is something they started doing in the 1900s, whereas or doing in a much more virulent form in the 1900s, whereas the Ottomans were always about 50 to 100 years behind
Mm.
what Europe was
Yeah.
doing, and always getting their asses kicked because of that. And what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the father of the Turkish nation, did was opt for a really hyper version of nationalism. And it wasn't just Ataturk, it was the guys, Ataturk, who took power in the 1920s. It was the guys who took power in 1908. Thankfully for Ataturk and his legacy, a lot of the really horrific aspects of the Armenian genocide, it's not that hard to make a historical case. We're like, that wasn't Ataturk. That was the monsters who were right before him who lost World War I. Though honestly, reading this book, I kind of get the sense that that distinction is a lot harder to make. We're happy to make that distinction in the United States and in Europe because we care a lot more about the Armenians. We don't care about the Kurds. And it's kind of interesting that the nasty bad old nationalists before Ataturk cleared out the Armenians. Oh, that's bad, that's evil, da da da. But the way that Ataturk treated the Kurds in the 1920s and the 1930s is disturbingly similar to the way that the nasty guys had treated the Armenians, but we don't really talk about it so much because,
Has your opinion of Ataturk gone down because of this book?
I'll be honest, it has a little bit, and I feel bad about that because I'm usually pretty happy holding up Ataturk as a secular saint. But it really is kind of extraordinary. His legacy of approaching, of the way that he sort of attacked these issues, certainly is vital to Turkish historical development, but it's also vital to Kurdish national development and historical development, in the same sense that you wouldn't have had a modern Turkey if it weren't for Russia brutalizing the Ottoman Empire. Like the extreme shifts that Ataturk imposed on Turkish and Kurdish culture allowed the idea of Kurdish nationalism to sort of come to the fore. But yeah, let's boomerang right back. Okay, so Saladin, great Kurdish hero. Wouldn't want to take that away from anybody, but this was the problem of the Ottoman Empire. This was the problem of, more broadly, of not being sort of up to date on very European ideas of nationalism, which are just normal across the world right now. Like the European idea of nationalism won everywhere. That's the status quo now. And what this book really, really underlines is that like that sense of European nationalism, like for the Kurds, is not only something that we can't even really find particularly good examples of it before like the 19-teens or even like the 1940s. Even today, the Kurds are mired in or simply are just have a more traditional view. Not all of them. The Kurdish scene today is extraordinarily different from a century ago. It is something that's still sort of changing. So Saladin was of Kurdish ethnicity. He might have spoke some version of a Kurdish language, but he was also fundamentally an Islamic ruler, and the primacy of religion and the importance of these religious identities is something that's still in contention between Kurds in Turkey today. There are more religiously affiliated Kurds. There are more, there are flagrantly leftist or even communist, atheistic, Kurdish ideological strands. This is something that's still being disputed. But the fundamental breakdown of the Kurds is that they were always used, both by the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, as buffer zones between the two. And the way you did that cheaply in a pre-modern empire was you gave a lot of rights and powers to local sort of potentates or notables, or there's because we're dealing with first two separate empires and then four separate countries in this book, all these terms are sort of used interchangeably, and they're different from region to region, or sheiks or emirs or this, that, and the other thing, and they're different over courses of time. But in between the Safavid and Ottoman empires, it does appear that the Ottomans come roaring into Kurdistan in the 1500s. Specifically, there's the 1514, the Battle of Calderon, or Chalderan, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that more or less settled some borders that still exist today. If you look on a map at the Middle East, and then you look at the border between Iran and Turkey, or Iran and Iraq, these borders actually look a lot more detailed
Mm.
because they actually go with geographical
Yeah.
features. They weren't the classic, as with
Mm.
Iraq or Jordan, the classic some
With a
imperialists
ruler.
yeah, with a ruler. No, these are borders that are sort of 400 years
And you could
old.
argue make sort of sense.
Yes. But on either side of that border, you had different versions of, but you had similar local rulers who had tremendous degree of control, owed some degree of fealty or obeisance to either the Safavid Shah or the Ottoman Sultan. But that fundamental dynamic of powerful, noble, for lack of a better word, families or hereditary aristocracies of some sort, were in control in these areas, and and had their own fights against each other. So that like kind of feudal, like we associate that with like medieval times in Europe, like this idea that, oh, what really matters is what the Duke of some such has a rivalry with the Duke of Berry next to him. And really, it's their rivalry that's more important when we're deciding whether England or France gets to control that. Like in Europe, we were kind of done with that in the 1600s. That sort of got stamped out in most places. Though, of course, that sort of thing was a big part of the 30 Years' War in Germany. But that was sort of like, for the large part, stamped out. Into the 20th century, and to some degree, even in conflicts in the 1980s, 1990s, that kind of like who's the noble family in charge is still really, really key. The Kurdistan regional government, which is the somewhat autonomous, tried to be independent, is not part of Iraq, is run by two political parties that compete. And there are some aspects of, like these are political parties that compete, but they're also kind of recognized to be the personal fiefdoms of two families. There's the Kurdistan Democratic Party, I think KDP is the Barzani family, and then the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the PUK, is the Talabani family. So this dynamic has made it really, really hard for people. Really only in the 20th century has this been a large-scale effort. For anybody who tries to get all the Kurds together, this has been a tremendous challenge because at every event, yes, there have been Kurds who desperately wanted their freedom, but there have also just been powerful people who, tribal is, I think, a word that gets used a lot, but every turn, absolutely, the Kurds have been disappointed by the United States, by Britain, by other imperial powers, and have faced tremendous brutality from, yes, I would say every single one of these governments. Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria have imposed incredible brutality on these populations. But also there is within these populations such a set of divisions and this isn't historically unique in any sense. Germany did not unify until the 1870s because of exactly this sort of dynamics. There were individual smaller princely states that were like, wait a second, I care about Germany, but I mostly care about the Hohenzollern family or something like that, And it's really part of the reason that the Kurdish experience has been so rough is that the Ottoman experience, which became the Turkish experience, was so rough, which was the Ottomans were 50 years behind Europe and got beaten up by Europe this way. And then the Kurds were 50 years behind the Turks and got all of the Turks' rage that was built up by being bullied by Europe thrown down on them.
But also the technological advances that they had received from Europe as well.
Absolutely. The Kurds have largely caught up on a lot of those dynamics. But
Can you see the Kurds? Are they all agreed on what direction they should go in the future, or is there still a lot of debate over that?
Oh, absolutely not. There's differing alliances, differing. So I think it's worth talking about. Well, to answer your question, no, they're not unified on which direction to go. There are within these four countries where there are Kurdish groups, there are tremendous divisions, tremendous anger, and between the Iraqi and the Iranian Kurds that were on separate sides of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. The Turkish government has been attempting to wipe out Syria's Kurds for quite some time, while also, this has been the dynamic of the past decade, while also having a close relationship with Iraq's Kurds. One of the reasons behind that being that the Iraq's Kurds provide a ton of oil and gas to Turkey. Yeah, so no, there's definitely not unity today. I think that there are certainly positive developments. There's certainly, compared to 100 years ago, there actually are like unified urban Kurdish parties in each of these four countries that have an ideology that's consistent, that they talk to each other and it makes sense. Whereas 100 years ago, and specifically 100 years ago, I keep coming back to that, was this tremendous shift, this sort of tremendous time of choosing or time of incredible geopolitical ferment that the Kurds were just not ready for, because mostly the folks who were leading what independent struggles they had were sort of either religious or tribal potentates that hated each other even more than they hated the Turks or the British or the French or the Iranians. So they had this dynamic, and just the Ottoman control of the majority of this population. So every Kurd well, not specifically, but the Kurdish regions in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq were all part of the Ottoman Empire. The population in Iran was part of the Safavid Empire, then the Kahar. I guess, do we even call that an empire? And then finally, the secular state generally seemed to be inaugurated by, I think there was sort of a revolution in 1906, and then there was Reza Shah, the father of the Shah that was kicked out in the 70s, sort of got started in the 1920s. That's sort of like the beginning of the modern Iranian state. But there is already a difference between the Kurds on the other side of that Persian-Ottoman border. A third of those, so most Kurds are Sunni, but a third of the Kurds in Iran over their hundreds of years in a Shia state did convert to Shiism. So that's sort of another division that makes that just sort of a little bit
But
stranger.
also, there's still like Christians and other religions in there as well, in the minorities that would still consider themselves Kurdish.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I would agree with that, but it is a very minor. I think it is a very
Oh, okay.
minor. Whereas like Arab Christians are a huge, I mean, not huge, but they are very significant, 5 to 10% across the Middle East. I do not think that Kurdish Christians or Jews amount to
Went to many.
that level.
Okay.
There are a lot of Kurdish, I believe the Yazidis are Kurdish, and then there are some other Zoroastrian descended religious sects in Iran that I think are more of a factor for Kurds. But yeah, so there's absolutely right. There is complexity here, but I think by and large, the majority of the Kurds are Sunni Islamic, which sort of became a key dynamic in one of the most horrific decades of the 20th
Hmm.
century. We talk about the bloodlands in Eastern Europe in the 1930s, 1940s, Stalin and Hitler ripping the region to shreds, truly horrific. That was sort of a World War II thing for Eastern Europe. For the, I guess, what we call it, Asia Minor or Anatolia, for Iran, the Middle East more broadly, the Turkey, what have you, that was World War I. World War I was sort of the Bloodlands era here. And the fact that the Kurds were Sunni allowed them to really play a pretty horrific part before being massively betrayed by the Turkish nationalists in the Bloodlands of Anatolia. I'm speaking, of course, about the Armenian genocide. And it is, you just have to take a moment to lament this extraordinary way of life that has completely vanished before European nationalism was brutally imposed on this region in the early 20th century. This was Kurdistan, but the population of Kurdistan, at least in the Ottoman realms, I think was more or less, I mean, Kurds might have been a slim majority, but Armenian Christians were also a huge part of this. This were Armenian peasants, there were Armenian villages. What became a real bone of contention was that the Armenians were Christian and had more natural affinities with the Russians, who were currently taking territory away from the Ottoman Empire, and some of them got richer because of that. The Kurds across the 19th century resented the centralizing instincts of the Ottoman Empire, and there were a lot of not necessarily nationalist, but just sort of like local, powerful Kurds who were like, Istanbul's taking rights away from me. I hate Istanbul. But what Istanbul was able to do was rally all the Kurds around the extermination of the Armenians, because the Armenians were Christians. They
Ah.
weren't Sunni Muslims like us. They were representatives of the Russians who actually were carrying out anti-Kurdish massacres as they took territory away from the Ottoman Empire, both during World War I, but a long time before World War I. The Young Turks government, which are called the Young Turks, largely to distinguish them from Ataturk and keep him as far away as possible from any responsibility for this Armenian genocide, which I think can be done kind of fairly. So the Armenians were wiped out. People had been there for 1,000 years, from the coast of the Mediterranean to the border of modern Armenia and the Caucasus. 1 million people at least killed and stormed out. One of the great crimes. And for a lot of those crimes, the Kurds were sort of the eager foot soldiers, because religion was used as a reason to kick these people out, massacre these people. And then you have the heroic era of Turkish nationalism, which the Kurds were also very willing to participate in and help with, because there absolutely was a point when the Ottomans had been beaten, and the British and the French and the Greeks and the Italians, and maybe the Americans, though they were never really that involved, were looking to completely divide up the territory of modern Turkey, after already stripping the entire Middle East. Before World War I, the whole Middle East, going around to Egypt, though Egypt was more nominal by that point, but certainly up to Egypt, was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. That was stripped away entirely. And in the early 1920s, the Greeks were trying to take over most of the Mediterranean coastline, and the Italians were there, and the French were there. And Ataturk did his truly heroic and impressive, basically kicking out of the victorious allies of World War I. And the Kurds were eager to participate in that. And part of the propaganda that was used to make that happen was Islam, which is a bit surprising if you know anything about Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, because once the Europeans were defeated, once modern Turkey had been saved, he quickly threw out the Sultan, disbanded the Caliphate, and inaugurated a serious program of secularization. And I still uncritically see that as a good thing. I think it created the modern Turkey today that I know and love. But certainly the current Turkish government would dispute whether that was such a good thing, and is eager to make everybody aware of the crimes that were part of that. And there were horrific crimes. Essentially, the Kurds were the eager foot soldiers of the Armenian genocide, the eager soldiers helping Ataturk to kick out these British, French, and Greek interlopers. And then Ataturk turned on the Kurds massively.
No.
So the largest Kurdish population is in Turkey. Iraq was established as a sort of a British mandate of Iraq. There was a monarch that the British worked with, but it was essentially British territory, taking Mosul, Baghdad, all that, which had been Ottoman. Syria, we went to the French, had been Ottoman. But I think there's a reason why the sort of Turkish-Kurdish dynamic gets the most attention. There are the most Kurds there. And certainly for 500 years, but when the Ottoman Turks controlled Iraq and Syria as well, there was this long history there. But at this point of division, where the French took what became Syria, the British took what became Iraq, you got a very clear sense of who was actually how not ready for
Hmm.
prime time the Kurdish nationalist groups were. The main figure in Iraq was Sheikh Mahmud, which is another one of these potentates. One of he was more a religious leader, I think, but also, I think Sheikh has religious connotations, perhaps of the Sufi orders or whatnot. I don't fully understand that. In Iran, it was Chief Simko Shikak, and in Turkey, it was Sheikh Said. The Sheikh Said rebellions in Turkey are just horrific, like the scale of what was going on here. You really had, Turkey had a very finely tuned military apparatus that had been kicking out all the European militaries, and then once that had been done, it went out to the east of the country. There's a really evocative thing that they said in here where military operations before the war in Syria, there's something and with the exception of Cyprus and maybe one other thing, it's like 23 out of 25 major Turkish military operations over the past century have taken place in
Oh,
Kurdistan.
God.
And the Sikh Said revolt was
One of those.
a key part of this. Like large scale ethnic cleansing, large scale massacres, essentially saying you are not Kurdish. Kurdish does not exist. And really just horrific stuff. But I think it's interesting to point out that it was Sheikh Said in Turkey. It was Sheikh Mahmud in Iraq. It was a chief of a tribal designation in Iran. These were not, while the rest of the world, this is in the 1920s, while the rest of the world, revolution, or not the rest of the world, sort of the more developed parts of the world across Europe, Latin America, what have you, where revolutions were carried out by people with political programs, general secretaries or commandants or what have you. What was happening in all four of the divisions. Haven't quite gotten to the details on
Uh-oh.
Syria, but there's very few Kurds there, despite their recent prominence. The revolutions were carried out by these very, frankly, reactionary figures who really didn't like these broader ideas of nationalism. And crucially, all of these, certainly these, Sheikh Said, Sheikh Mahmud, the Chief Simko Shikak, all of them were absolutely overpowered by more modern militaries in Iran, Turkey, and British Iraq. But they were also overpowered by divisions that these broader governments were able to get. They had a lot of Kurds. The oppressing governments had a lot of Kurds fighting on their side because it was more about traditional feudal rights than it was about a unified nationalist idea, which was just really fascinating to me. So Sheikh Mahmud, it's not to say that there was no influence. Sheikh Mahmud, and I don't know if this is a rumor, but because it does sound, it's sort of too good to check, but it did make it into the history of modern
Okay.
Kurds. But Sheikh Mahmud, this is the guy who led a couple rebellions in Iraq, and he did better than Sheikh Said, who was executed along with his entire family. I'm not sure about that entire family, but he was executed along with many of his followers. Sheikh Mahmud, I think, did manage to, would get exiled periodically and then come back, and the British were a little kinder to him. But apparently on one of his rebellions, he went into battle with a Quran with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points
Oh,
written in the margins or
okay.
something along those lines, which is I think is just wonderfully evocative of just the weird level of influence that Woodrow Wilson and his ideas of self-determination, whether or not he actually held them, that power that it had across the world, but also just where this feudal potentate's thoughts really were. It's in the Quran. Woodrow Wilson got to be a marginal note in the Quran as he went into battle. But it was just fascinating dynamics here, and it's quite extraordinary the extent to which that process continued and still continues down to this day. I think we talked about the Kurdistan regional government. Even after 100 years of development, you've still got sort of family parties. And I mean, this is a dynamic. I mean, gosh, you can argue that the Democratic Party in the United States was excessively beholden to the Clintons for a while, or private families. But it's not a good thing in any democracy.
No, definitely not.
And
I
yes.
think history has proven that.
And I guess probably where we'll end up today is that we did finally get the first emergence of an independent Kurdish state in perhaps the least likely regions for that to happen, which was in Iran. And this was, I think, probably happened in Iran because of the weakness of the Iranian state at that time, specifically in the aftermath of World War II. During World War II, in one of history's weirder pairings, the Soviet Union and the British Empire essentially divvied up Iran.
Mm.
The Soviets obviously taking more of the north, and the British taking more of the south, more on the sea, and focusing on Britain's naval power. This opened up some space, and it seems like there was a lot of Soviet sympathy for this, though only a certain degree of support. But the Kurds were sort of in between, or once again, sort
Yeah,
of
they're
at the borders.
historically where they seem to end up on the hinterland between empires.
At the borders of the Soviet and British spheres of influence in Iran. So in 1946, and pretty much just for 1946, we got the Republic of Mahabad, which was sort of the first brief kind of independent Turkish state. I'm not entirely certain whether I would call, well, no, I would definitely call it on many fronts to be a less serious attempt at independence than the Kurdistan Regional Government in Iraq, that I think has largely been in existence to some degree since the 1990s, and of course a higher degree of existence since 2003, and then curtailed a bit in 2017, I believe, but still has a high degree of autonomy, and is certainly a much longer lasting example of Kurdish governance than the Republic of Mahabad. But the Republic of Mahabad was the first Kurdish government, and crucially, it I think ended up having a figurehead who had some kind of like hereditary aristocratic-ish dynamic, but it was set up by urban, workers and intellectuals in, I believe, the city of Mahabad. I'm not sure if that's a city or a region in Iran, and that's sort of, but it's an indicator of like just how far behind the Kurds were, that it's really 1946 where we say, certainly before 1946, there were more modern political parties that were aiming for that sort of thing. But it's fascinating the way, and I'm only halfway through the book. I'm just sort of beginning to trace the way that those lineages of the Republic of Mahabad, it was the Kurdish, I think Kurdish Democratic Party, started out in the Republic of Mahabad and is now kind of one of the main figures in the Kurdistan regional government, one of main actors. The Republic of Mahabad did feature important participation by Iraqi Kurds. So it's very interesting how that all works. But I think the main thing I want to emphasize in this episode is that it's all very recent, and it's very real. That there are real Kurdish political parties with real agendas, real hopes and dreams, but it's not as long-standing an effort as perhaps some might portray it.
Can I hit you with a curveball? It seems like the country with the fifth largest Kurdish population is Germany. Would that be because they took a lot of refugees during Syria, or is there historical ties there that a lot of people aren't aware of?
Well, that would predate. I have seen myself, I think, Turkish-Kurdish oppositional rioting in Berlin,
Wow.
in Kreuzberg. And then a bunch of German cops just very heavily armored being like, I don't understand. The huge dynamic in Germany is taking in tons and tons of Turks in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even through the 80s. And of course, if you've got a large Turkish population, then it becomes... Now, this is a period of time when the Turkish government did not acknowledge that Kurds existed. There's the famous, they're mountain Turks, or what have you. So predominantly the populations that would go from Turkey to Germany were poorer, disenfranchised groups. So they would have been officially designated as Turks, certainly have Turkish citizenship. But when they go to Germany and feel that they are safe staying in Germany, it would not be surprising at all that a lot of those nominal Turks decided to embrace their Kurdish identity because they felt free to do so. So yeah, I think that's
because it's about 1.2 to 1.5 million, which is a sizable amount of people.
Out of what's the number for Turks in Germany? It's probably 5 million, 5 or 6, or maybe even higher. Yeah, something like that. So yeah, that's just part of indisputably, I think the largest Kurdish city is Istanbul, because that's where people who are poor. So that's not just to some extent, I think, but to a much smaller extent than you were suggesting. The war in Syria might have
Mm-hmm.
something to do with that. But I think that's much more driven by the the Turkish war on the Kurds in the 1990s, where large-scale village clearance
Mm.
was a thing that was happening. So the first step is when your village gets cleared out is you go to Diyarbakir. Also could be, I think in the 1990s was also a fairly unpleasant
Yeah.
place. So then you go to Istanbul, and that's where you build your life, or maybe you build it in Berlin. I dated a woman in Turkey who was from Diyarbakir, was from a very Kurdish region, and it was fascinating because her ethnicity would depend on who had most recently done the worst outrage.
Oh.
If the PKK, if the Kurdish Nationalist Party had done some kind of bombing, she was strongly Turkish and condemned that sort of thing. If the Turkish government had carried out some kind of massacre, or there was a bombing that was like Islamic State, but maybe it's the Turkish government, she was incredibly strongly Kurdish and and that's something that makes this, as I think we've mentioned before, that makes this very, very different. The Turkish-Kurdish issue very, very different from, say, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, where the Israelis just want to exterminate the Palestinians. Turks have been extraordinarily violent, even genocidal against Kurds. But if you just say you're Turkish, you're fine. And I mean, that overstates it.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly there's discrimination against people who might appear a little bit more Kurdish, but that's a hard thing to maintain in Turkey, where as long as you're Turkish nationalist, you can look like me, you can look like you're from Mongolia, you can look like you are from Saudi Arabia, you can look like you're
Or a
from...
mountain Turk.
Exactly. As long as you are a fervent Turkish nationalist, it doesn't matter. Actually, I think Hakan Fidan, who I believe is Erdogan's most likely successor at this point, now that all of Erdogan's sons and sons-in-law have proven to be complete wastes of space, it seems like Hakan Fidan is the most likely successor, and I think his lineage, openly declared, is mostly Kurdish, but he's a fervent Turkish nationalist. And that is, I guess, to say something
Yeah.
positive about the Turks after a pretty horrific episode for the Turks, that is something that is on offer. And to be clear, if I didn't mention it, the Iranians have been incredibly horrific to the Kurds. The Iraqis have been incredibly horrific to the Kurds. And the Syrians.
Would Turkey be the best place of the four currently for Kurds to live in?
I wouldn't say that because of Turkish policies necessarily, though they're not bad. Not as bad as they have been by Turkish standards. I would say that Turkey's just the best place of those four
Yeah, it's the
countries to
most
live,
stable,
economically
it's the
speaking,
wealthiest.
by far. Yeah, by far. Yeah, you don't want to live, even probably Kurds still have the most rights and control as Kurdish nationalists, probably in the Kurdish regional government, or, for another 2 weeks in Syria. But Turkey, and this is part of the reason why, to some degree, before 2015, and possibly starting again now, the Kurds are sort of reconciling themselves the most to the national state, is because there are rewards to being with that national state, because there's a lot of economic development, there's a lot of wealth on offer if you just relax on that Kurdish thing. So that is sort of something that Turkey offers that the other three countries manifestly do not at this point.
So, a very difficult episode, and I'm sure our next episode will be much lighter. Cheer us all up.
Yeah. Everybody loves talking about Israel and free speech. That'll be a great time.
Oh. All the best. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.